The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. She sat frozen at the defense table, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. This was the man she had confided in during her darkest moments, the person who had held her when she cried, who had promised her that everything would be okay. And now he was about to speak words that would destroy her. The prosecutor leaned forward with a slight smile, sensing victory. Her attorney looked pale, unprepared for what was coming. Because what this man was about to say would flip the entire case on its head. It would make a jury question everything they thought they knew. It would take a woman they saw as a victim and turn her into a suspect. And the most haunting part? He would do it all while looking her directly in the eyes, without a single crack in his composure. Was he lying to save himself? Or had she been hiding something all along? This is the story of a woman who found herself at the center of a criminal investigation that tore her life apart, not because of what she did, but because of what someone else said she did. The crime itself was shocking enough to make headlines, a violent incident that left investigators scrambling for answers and a community demanding justice. But what made this case truly unforgettable was the testimony of the one person she believed would stand by her no matter what. He was her closest confidant, someone who knew her routines, her fears, her secrets. When detectives came knocking, they didn't just rely on forensic evidence or surveillance footage. They relied on him. His words became the foundation of the prosecution's case, and when he took the stand, those words would seal her fate. Her name, for the sake of this story, was Emily. She was 32 years old, a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago. People who knew her described her as dependable, the kind of person who always showed up early to work and stayed late when deadlines loomed. She wasn't flashy or loud. She preferred book clubs to bars, hiking trails to nightclubs. Her apartment was small but tidy, decorated with plant houses she'd named and photos from trips she'd taken alone because she enjoyed the solitude. Emily had been through a difficult breakup about a year before the incident, a relationship that had ended not in explosive arguments, but in slow, painful silence. She'd thrown herself into her work after that, trying to rebuild a sense of purpose. Her coworkers noticed she seemed more withdrawn, quicker to decline invitations for after-work drinks. But no one thought much of it. People process heartbreak differently. What they didn't know was that Emily had started feeling watched, followed even, in the weeks leading up to the crime. She'd mentioned it to a few people, brushed it off as paranoia, but that feeling never went away. His name was Daniel. He was 35, a freelance graphic designer who had known Emily for nearly 4 years. They'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party and had stayed in touch ever since, bonding over their shared love of obscure documentaries and terrible reality television. Daniel had been there when Emily's relationship fell apart. He'd been the one to bring her takeout when she didn't want to leave her apartment, the one who let her vent for hours without judgment. He was charming in an understated way, the kind of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the room when he spoke to you. But those who knew him well recognized a pattern. Daniel had a way of inserting himself into people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. He thrived on being needed. And while most saw it as kindness, a few quietly wondered if there was something more calculated beneath the surface. He had a history of relationships that ended poorly, friendships that dissolved without clear explanations. People would describe him as supportive one year and completely absent the next. Emily had never noticed these patterns, or if she had, she'd chosen to ignore them. To her, Daniel was the one person who truly understood her. It happened on a Friday night in late September. Emily had left work around 6 in the evening, later than usual because she'd been preparing a presentation for the following Monday. Surveillance footage from her office building showed her walking to her car alone, carrying her laptop bag and a coffee she'd grabbed from the break room. She texted Daniel at 6:43, a simple message asking if he wanted to meet up for dinner. He replied 7 minutes later saying he was busy but they could talk later. Emily drove home, stopping briefly at a grocery store to pick up ingredients for a salad. The cashier who checked her out would later tell police that she seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but not upset or distressed. She arrived at her apartment complex at 7:32. A neighbor saw her walking toward her unit, keys in hand, still holding her phone. That was the last confirmed sighting of Emily before everything went wrong. At approximately 9:15 that night, a 911 call came in from a nearby resident reporting sounds of a struggle and broken glass. Police arrived within 8 minutes to find Emily's front door slightly ajar, the interior of her apartment in disarray. Furniture was overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, and there were signs of a violent altercation. But Emily was gone. Her phone, her wallet, her keys, all left behind. For 3 agonizing days, investigators searched for her, while her family and friends held vigils and plastered missing person flyers across the city. Then, on Monday morning, a jogger found Emily disoriented and injured in a park, nearly 15 miles from her home. She had no memory of how she got there. When Emily was brought to the hospital, she could barely speak. She had bruises on her arms, a gash on her forehead, and signs of dehydration. Investigators waited hours before they could interview her, and even then her account was fragmented. She remembered being in her apartment, hearing a noise, and then everything went black. She didn't know who had attacked her or why. She couldn't explain the missing days. Investigators immediately began piecing together her movements and interviewing everyone in her life. Daniel was one of the first people they called. He seemed cooperative, even eager to help. He told detectives that Emily had been acting strangely in the weeks before she disappeared, that she'd mentioned feeling paranoid and even suggested someone was following her. He said he'd been worried about her mental state, that she'd been under a lot of stress at work and hadn't been sleeping well. His timeline matched the text messages they had exchanged, and he provided his location data showing he was at a coffee shop across town during the time of the incident. But as investigators dug deeper, small cracks began to appear. Daniel's phone records showed he'd deleted several messages between himself and Emily in the days leading up to her disappearance. When asked why, he claimed it was just routine cleanup, that he deleted old conversations to free up storage. Then there was the matter of his alibi. While his phone pinged a tower near the coffee shop, the shop's security footage didn't show him inside during the time he claimed to be there. When pressed, Daniel adjusted his story slightly. Maybe he'd been in his car nearby, he said. Maybe he'd lost track of time. These inconsistencies should have made him a person of interest, but instead, Daniel did something unexpected. He shifted the focus entirely onto Emily. The courtroom was packed the day Daniel took the stand. Emily's attorney had tried to prepare her, but nothing could have readied her for what was about to happen. Daniel walked in wearing a button-down shirt and khakis, looking every bit the concerned friend. He avoided looking at Emily as he was sworn in.
The prosecutor began with softballs, establishing Daniel's relationship with Emily, painting him as a trusted confidant who had no reason to lie. Then came the shift. The prosecutor asked Daniel if Emily had ever talked about harming herself. Daniel paused, as if the question pained him, and then nodded slowly. He said that in the weeks before the incident, Emily had made comments about wanting to disappear, about feeling like she couldn't handle her life anymore. He claimed she'd talked about staging something dramatic, something that would make people pay attention to her. The defense attorney objected immediately, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Daniel continued, his voice steady and calm. He testified that on the night Emily disappeared, she had called him, not texted, but called, and during that call she'd sounded erratic, almost manic. He said she'd told him she was going to do something drastic, that she needed people to believe she was in danger so they'd finally take her seriously. He claimed he'd tried to talk her down, but she'd hung up on him. There were no phone records to support this claim because Daniel said Emily had used a burner phone, one that was never recovered. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Emily's face went pale. Her attorney scrambled to discredit the testimony, but Daniel had an answer for everything. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed every word he was saying, or at least wanted everyone else to believe he did. By the time he stepped down, the prosecution had what they needed. A narrative in which Emily had orchestrated her own disappearance, possibly to cover up something else, possibly just for attention. And the man she'd trusted most in the world had just handed them that narrative on a silver platter. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily's defense team knew they had to act fast. They hired a private investigator to dig into Daniel's background, and what they found was deeply troubling. Daniel had a history that Emily had never known about. 3 years earlier, he'd been questioned in connection with another case involving a woman who had accused him of harassment. The charges were dropped after the woman suddenly recanted her statement and moved out of state. Friends of that woman later said she'd been terrified, that Daniel had made her feel like she was losing her mind, gaslighting her into believing she was the unstable one. Then there was the financial angle. Investigators discovered that Daniel had been struggling with debt, significant debt from a failed business venture and mounting credit card bills. Just days after Emily's disappearance, he'd received a sudden influx of cash, $10,000 deposited into his account. When questioned, he claimed it was payment for a freelance project, but he couldn't provide any documentation or client name. The defense theory began to take shape. What if Daniel had been involved in Emily's attack? What if he'd orchestrated it, or at the very least, knew more than he was letting on? And what if his testimony wasn't about helping the investigation, but about deflecting suspicion away from himself? The prosecution fought hard to keep this information out of the trial, arguing it was circumstantial and prejudicial. But the defense managed to get some of it in front of the jury during cross-examination. When Daniel was recalled to the stand, his calm demeanor began to crack. He stumbled over answers, contradicted himself on minor details, and grew visibly agitated when pressed about the money. But by then, the seed had already been planted in the jury's mind. Was he a concerned friend, or was he something far more dangerous? After 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Emily was found not guilty of staging her own disappearance or any related charges. But the victory felt hollow. The trial had destroyed her reputation, cost her job, and left her with legal bills she'd be paying off for years. Her family had fractured under the pressure, some believing her, others questioning whether there was truth to Daniel's claims. She moved out of state, changed her name, and tried to rebuild her life in quiet anonymity. Daniel was never charged with anything. Despite the inconsistencies in his testimony and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his finances, there wasn't enough concrete evidence to bring a case against him. He deleted his social media accounts, stopped taking freelance work under his real name, and disappeared from public view. Some believe he got away with something terrible. Others think he was just a man caught in the middle of a tragic situation, trying to help in the only way he knew it. The truth, as it often does, remains somewhere between testimony and evidence. Emily rarely speaks about what happened. In a brief interview 2 years after the trial, she said the hardest part wasn't the attack itself, but the betrayal that came after. She said she still doesn't know if Daniel orchestrated everything or simply took advantage of a situation to save himself. But she knows one thing with certainty. The person she trusted most became the weapon used to destroy her. Trust is a fragile thing. It's built slowly, over shared meals and late-night conversations, and promises kept in the smallest moments. But it can be shattered in an instant, with a single sentence spoken under oath. This case reminds us that the justice system doesn't just weigh evidence, it weighs words. And sometimes the most damning words come from the people we'd never suspect. Emily's story isn't just about a crime or a trial. It's about how quickly a life can unravel when someone decides that protecting themselves matters more than protecting the truth. So here's the question we'll leave you with. Based on everything you've heard, the timeline, the contradictions, the sudden money, the pattern of behavior, do you think Daniel's testimony was truthful, or was it strategic? And if you were in Emily's position, sitting in that courtroom, watching someone you trusted turn against you, how would you even begin to process that kind of betrayal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.